Tonight, some girl who's maybe 17 or 18 years old is going to be looking in her closet trying to figure out what can I put on to wear to attract men because I have to make X amount of dollars.
She's not a streetwalker. She's hidden in clubs, in hotels, exploited in ads on the web.
There are numerous internet sites that a man, a John, can go and buy a girl at any time.
Men who just want to satisfy their lust.
Some of my clients, regular clients, were law enforcement. A couple of them were judges, athletes, politicians.
Human trafficking is more profitable than drug trafficking.
You can only sell the drugs one time. With the victim, you can sell that person over and over again.
In St. Louis, there are children for sale.
These girls are victims, and I've yet to meet a girl that grew up saying, I want to be a prostitute.
Pat Bradley, President, International Crisis Aid. Bradley says there's a thriving underground trade in the St. Louis area.
What I've been told by federal law enforcement is that it's virtually in every city in America.
In fact, a Justice Department study put St. Louis in the top 20 regions for sex trafficking. International Crisis Aid recently opened its first shelter for victims in this region. The risk to these girls is so real, the location kept secret.
In here, we have 11 bedrooms set up. Each girl gets her own bedroom. We have a counseling.
Bradley gives a tour of one wing of the donated building. The home has room for nearly 24 girls. He doubts that's even scratching the surface.
If you know where to go and you check it out online, it's just page after page after page of, let's say it this way, potential victims.
But until recently, the term sex trafficking was something few people in this area had heard.
It's not like they're walking up and down the streets of St. Louis County, trying to pick up men. So a lot of people just don't see what's happening behind the scenes. So I think they don't think it's an issue.
Sergeant Adam Kavanaugh, Special Investigations Unit, St. Louis County Police, and Deputy Commander of the Missouri Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. The Johns know where to go. Kavanaugh says there's no doubt they know they're buying underage girls. The average age of victims, 13, and investigators have seen much younger, even toddlers.
It's blatantly obvious what's being advertised. Especially when a lot of them will have pictures of girls, unclothed. And the way they're worded, a lot of these people don't try and hide it. They're very obvious in what they're doing.
These children pay the price for men to have momentary pleasure.
A lot of these girls, by the time we've seen them, unfortunately have been brutally beat sometimes, raped. They're held in conditions that are not the most livable conditions. Some of them don't eat but once a day. They're held in hotel rooms and not allowed to leave unless they leave with their trafficker. So mentally, they're really beaten down.
And when the cops get too close, these traffickers pick up stakes.
One of the things the traffickers do is move victims from place to place, from city to city. Here, of course, it's easy to go back and forth across the river.
As head of Hoyleton Youth and Family Services in East St. Louis, Illinois, Cleo Terry trains police and social workers in what to spot. Terry says moving just gives pimps another measure of control over their girls.
Before long, the person doesn't even know where she is. Her world comes down to this one manager who controls everything she does from the time she gets up until the time she goes to bed.
Who are these girls and how are they trapped? In our next report. Megan Lynch, News Radio 1120, KMOX.
I'm an exotic dancer. I wanted to be an actress.
I'm an addict. I wanted to be a doctor.
I'm being sold for sex. I wanted to be a lawyer.
No, they're living my dream.
Talk to children about their dreams. If you don't, someone else will.
This public service announcement highlights what experts say is common in sex trafficking. Victims lured with the promise of a better life, then kept captive with threats, violence, drugs. It's not truckloads of girls coming from across the border. Police tell KMOX most of the victims they come in contact with are local, some from average families, others from dysfunction.
I would say at least 40 to 50% come from being placed in some type of foster care, running away, sometimes being thrown out of the place where they're living. Sometimes that happens repeatedly. Sometimes parents are either incarcerated or not in the picture at all.
Cindy Malott sits on a couch in a small, dimly lit counseling room. Malad is the Crisis Intervention Supervisor for the YWCA Regional Sexual Assault Center.
I think a lot of traffickers focus on young adolescents who are very vulnerable.
Pimps are known to hang out at bus stations, train stations, and airports. They'll offer kids a place to stay, a warm meal, understanding, and acceptance.
For a young, vulnerable adolescent who feels like they're on their own or have nowhere to go, that can be just what they feel like they're looking for.
It's short-lived. Soon control and isolation begin.
She only is allowed to make phone calls when someone else is present, or she's not allowed to make phone calls at all.
The victim's often a target of threats.
And they've seen the person be violent with other people. They have no reason not to believe wholeheartedly, yes, he knows where my family is. He knows where my grandmother lives. He'll go back and hurt them. He'll kill them. I have to keep my mouth shut.
They don't see any point trying to escape.
They may be told, fine, you go to the police, tell them what's going on. You're going to get arrested for prostitution. Look, there's all these advertisements for you online where you're obviously prostituting yourself. So go ahead, report me. You're going to go down with me.
It's also likely their pimp is pumping them full of drugs.
Enhances that dependency because the addiction is there, and that's used as a weapon and a reward for their participation.
You heard from Cleo Terry in our first report. As coordinator of the Rescue and Restore Coalition of Southwestern Illinois, Terry has learned getting victims hooked on drugs is insurance. They won't go to police.
They would be so intimidated by the thought of losing their supply of drugs that they would be very unlikely to acknowledge that they had been forced into the area of prostitution.
All of it takes a toll. The average life expectancy of someone in this sex trade is 7 years. Some become so addicted to drugs, they're no longer sellable, so they're thrown into the streets to end up as an overdose statistic. Others are taken out by violence.
I have to earn $1,000 tonight. How many men do I have to see tonight in order to do that? And what do I have to do to get these men? I mean, do I need to go get in a car, walk in a strange hotel room? I mean, that's high risk.
Pat Bradley with International Crisis Aid says there's also the psychological trauma.
If she sees 5 men that night, she's just been raped 5 times in one night. And how many times is that going? 5, 6 nights a week. You know, you're talking about thousands of times that girl's been raped if she ever gets a chance to be rescued.
In our next report, one victim tells what it's like to be sold for sex.
You know, they call it the grind for a reason.
Megan Lynch, News Radio 1120, KMOX.
For a long time, it really took away my humanity, my ability to just interact with people.
Kicked out of her house, Katie Rhodes was living in her car, no job, not in school. A friend suggested an easy way to make money, be a stripper.
And so I did it. I did it with the intention that I was going to go into it for a couple months, and that was it. I was going to make some money, get an apartment, so I can get another job and get out, and that did not happen.
A growing drug habit kept her chained. Katie was desperate to find a way out. That's when a new girl strolled into the club.
She carried herself very differently. She had a lot of bling, had a lot of jewelry, fancy clothes.
Her boyfriend was in the music industry and just happened to need girls like Katie to help him with promotions. So she joined him in California. At first, was treated like a star.
When I got there, it was whining and dining, going to fancy restaurants, going shopping.
Soon enough, the party was over. Katie was put to work.
I started stripping in the clubs down there with the promise that I didn't have to do anything more than just strip.
That promise was quickly broken.
The clubs that I worked in were basically brothels. Some of them looked like they belonged in a third world country.
She felt like she had no way out, miles away from her family and friends.
Within a couple weeks, my cell phone supposedly got stolen, which I know better these days. That was all my contacts. It was all my contacts to back home. And so I didn't have any contact with anybody back home.
She was put under lock and key.
I wasn't left alone for very long, actually at all, for several months. I was either in line of sight of my pimp or the bottom girl.
The bottom girl, the one who's been with the pimp the longest, broken enough to stay, and willing to do the pimp's dirty work. If being watched constantly wasn't enough to keep Katie captive, the threats were.
I mean, for me, it was a lot of witnessing violence. So it became clear very quickly that if I stepped too far out of line, that there was definitely violence around the corner.
Katie says her pimp expected a return on his investment.
The reality was that we didn't have a choice to say no. Our pimp, we had a quota, we had a $1,000 quota that we had to bring in minimally a night. If our pimp said we're going to a call, we're going to a call.
A girl who failed to produce or worse tried to run could be sold to another pimp or wind up in the dumpster. So she did what she was told, working in the club 10 hours a day, on call all night.
You know, they call it the grind for a reason. We lived, worked, and slept that club and that work.
The Johns, they came from all walks of life.
Some of my clients, regular clients, were law enforcement. A couple of them were judges, athletes, politicians.
When Katie finally realized it was far riskier to stay than to run, it took her months to get out, to convince her pimp she could be trusted out of his sight. That's when she slipped away, contacted an old family friend, and hid for several days until she could get into rehab in another state.
It took me a very long time in rehab to even acknowledge that I was involved in prostitution. I said I was a stripper and that was it. That's all I was.
Katie says her pimp still had a hold on her from miles away. At one point, she even called him to apologize for running and ruining his reputation. It took her several years to stop looking over her shoulder. She still carries the scars.
Men, for years, and I still have a hard time with this sometimes, but for several years, every man I saw was a trick. Everybody could hurt me. Everybody's motives were impure. So if somebody helped me, it was, what do you want?
Today, Rhodes has moved forward. She has her master's degree in social work and is the founder of Healing Action Network, an organization dedicated to helping and empowering survivors like herself. Next time,
I could look at the photos of the girls and recognize the hotel that the girls were being sold in.
Investigators go to the internet for clues, but that doesn't mean someone's going to jail. Megan Lynch, News Radio 1120, KMOX. Marble floors, extravagant art, designer furniture. This could be one of dozens of hotel properties in the St. Louis region that detectives suspect are the staging ground for the underage sex trade.
We don't have that issue here. We're a 5-star property. We don't have this issue here. We're a family resort, when in fact, it did indeed happen at those hotels.
Kimberly Ritter, Senior Account Manager and Trafficking Initiative Coordinator for NICS Conference and Meeting Management. About 5 years ago, Ritter was asked by a group to find them a hotel that took a stand against trafficking.
When they said child sex trafficking, I had no idea what it was. I thought it was something that happened in a third world country.
Ritter discovered evidence of it happening across the U.S., not just at the No-Tell Motel.
I could look on the internet at a website called Backpage.com, where you can buy a washing machine, you can buy a meat grinder, and you could buy a girl. I could look at the photos of the girls and recognize the hotel that the girls were being sold in.
The reaction from big chains was denial.
On the lucky occasion, the girls would be posed so that you could see out the window and I could see monuments in the city,
including in St. Louis. KMOX News contacted a number of hotels. None returned our phone calls. Ritter found one, the Millennium, willing to train employees on the red flags.
Housekeeping may receive a call for fresh towels or fresh sheets. Occasionally, room service may receive a call for ice cream to settle down a younger girl.
Her internet research has led her to believe it is a significant issue.
It's happening on a nightly basis, and it's not just a few girls.
Yet if you look at court cases, there isn't a big stack. The federal courthouse in St. Louis has seen some notable ones. Wakita Wallace admitted she beat and tortured a mentally disabled girl she invited to live with her and sold for sex. Carl Matthews, sentenced to 10 years in prison after admitting he beat and threatened to kill a woman, forcing her into prostitution for 2 years. Latasha McFarland, prosecutors say she lured a 13-year-old runaway into prostitution, posted pictures of her online, and drove her to hotels for Johns. How big is sex trafficking in the St. Louis region?
We think it's a little bit more widespread than we've been able to crack, but we really don't know.
U.S. Attorney Richard Callahan. So far, most cases have involved just a few victims at a time.
I like to think we haven't had those larger prosecutions because it doesn't exist. But it could be we just haven't discovered it yet.
Not every suspected trafficker that's been busted has wound up in court.
You need the cooperation of the victim. If the victim doesn't believe they're being exploited, it becomes a lot more difficult. We've had prosecutions where the runaway continued to run away on us, and we weren't able to have any confidence that come trial that we'd be able to produce the witness.
The agencies who work with victims say there are many things holding them back. For one, the threat of violence or death. Dee Dee Lehman is with Covering House.
It's hard for people to wrap their minds around why aren't these men being prosecuted. One big reason is the girls have to come forward and they have to testify, and they're scared.
Katie Rhodes of Healing Action Network says they're worried about survival.
If they don't know where they're going to get their next meal, if they don't know where they're going to put their head down, where they're going to get their baby's formula, they don't care about the prosecution.
And experts say they've been brainwashed into believing things are better with their captors. Lara Fallon, social work coordinator at the International Institute in St. Louis, remembers a massage parlor bust several years ago.
You could tell that the women had been trained on what to say if they were ever caught by law enforcement.
Fallon says it was obvious what was happening.
And they all lived in a back room. And you can see that. You could see where they were sleeping, where they were eating.
They kept silent.
They claimed that they weren't victims, which does happen. And then they were just booked on prostitution, then they were released, and then they were gone.
What will it take to expose more sex traffickers in St. Louis when our special report, Children for Sale, concludes? Megan Lynch, News Radio 1120, KMOX.
But I'm going to tell you something. If you pay the price, you can get what you want. I can get it for you.
Really?
And if you want something really young, that $200 it just costs a little more than that.
Sure.
But how young you talking? Talk to me.
Well, how young do you have?
Well, I don't have nothing younger than 14.
In this undercover video from Shared Hope International, that suspected pimp eventually admits he does have girls much younger than 14 for a price. Plenty of buyers are willing to pay.
It is a lucrative business.
Kimberly Ritter, Trafficking Initiative Coordinator for NICS Conference and Meeting Management, says selling sex is big money.
The average pimp has 4 to 6 girls. He's making about $250,000 a year on a girl. And the fact is that without the demand, we wouldn't have the problem. And men buy girls.
I don't think that they view them as human beings, just a commodity.
Dee Dee Lehman, founder and executive director of Covering House. Lehman says traditionally it's been the women who've taken the fall.
Years ago, when things like this went down, it was the prostitute first, then the pimp, and then way down the line was the John, the man who was purchasing, if anything happened. We know that if there wasn't a demand from purchasing, there would be no problem.
Lehman seems skeptical that people are truly oblivious.
You can't have a girl in a room all night long and men coming in and out and checking in and out without luggage and somebody not being aware of what's going on.
A study of 11 cities by the Justice Department reached the conclusion communities tolerate sex trafficking, that a demand for younger victims drives recruitment of girls, and that minor children are more often arrested for prostitution than offered help or treatment for the violence they've suffered. Investigators KMOX interviewed admit they've had to change their mindset. Sergeant Adam Kavanaugh, St. Louis County Police.
Really the last couple of years, we really started targeting more of the people that are running these girls as opposed to looking at the girls as suspects all the time.
In recent ratings by Shared Hope International, both Missouri and Illinois did score well for laws meant to enable first responders to quickly identify victims and get them help.
The first responders, whether that be law enforcement or healthcare, are really the people that are going to recognize the victims.
Lieutenant Angela Kuntz, commander of the intelligence unit for the St. Louis City Police, says officers are receiving new training to help them look beyond the obvious.
We might go on a domestic violence call that we are able to recognize that it could be a human trafficking case.
At the start of the year, the Intelligence Division took over trafficking cases because of their complexity.
Typically, these cases take a considerable amount of time to work because the traffickers are very good at hiding themselves. So we sometimes run into the victims. It takes us a while to identify the traffickers. There's a lot of nicknames involved.
She wouldn't get specific, but Kuntz did add the department is moving towards sting operations as a more effective way to bring down traffickers. What law enforcement and prosecutors say is also desperately needed is more support for victims.
Certainly, it's good to prosecute the traffickers, but unless when we're done at the end of the day with a case, if these girls don't have a chance to rebuild their lives, then I don't think that we're really doing our jobs.
In the last year, St. Louis has seen its first shelter for victims of trafficking, as well as new resources for counseling and support. With 300,000 children in the United States estimated to be at risk, it's barely enough. Some question whether most people are really ready to open their eyes.
I think it's easy to allocate trafficking victims as juvenile delinquents or prostitutes or basically dehumanize them, as opposed to look a little bit deeper and you see people who have been through horrific traumas, sometimes multiple, sometimes from early on in their lives.
Cindy Malott, YWCA.
I think it's so much harder for us as a community to wrap our mind around these are victims. I think it's easy for all of us to kind of view this as, oh, these are problematic people. They keep getting themselves into these horrible situations.
International Crisis Aid's Pat Bradley says they're not just runaways.
You got to ask the question, what are they running from?
Bradley says it points to bigger problems in our communities.
They're either running away from some kind of physical, verbal, emotional abuse, or they're running away because of poverty.
Katie Rhodes, founder of Healing Action Network, says all too often we may only know them as statistics.
A lot of times, they end up as Jane Does.
They're not allowed in regular society.
Once you've been in the life, if you have any sort of record showing that you're involved in prostitution, good luck getting a job. It's practically impossible.
By the time you see an 18, 19, 20-year-old walking the streets, she may have been in the life for years. Advocates want you to see that 12 or 13-year-old.
The number one thing that the public can do is stop assuming that it's just prostitution. Because if you cannot look past that girl as a prostitute, you're not going to see any of the signs.
And someone will think it's all right to have children for sale. Megan Lynch, News Radio 1120 KMOX.